contenidos. Voy a combinar, le he pedido a Leopoldo que with due respect to our friends coming from the US, vamos a hacer una cosa que básicamente va a ser en inglés, pero vamos a intentar hacer una cosa bilingual, so that we can understand, because the translation was, we couldn't get the translation in the short time that we had to organize this event. It's a great pleasure, and I'm being very honest, to have Leopoldo again at the Ateneo de Madrid. Leopoldo is very well known by all of us, of course, but it's also a friend of mine from 10 years ago, probably more than 10 years ago. But there are also some friends here that I'm very glad to meet again. Además de Leopoldo, tenemos a dos personas que me encanta tener, aunque no las conocía, las estoy conociendo ahora. Ellos son alumni de la Fundación Obama, que está haciendo un desarrollo muy interesante en lo que tiene que ver con desinformación y estas nuevas dictaduras, las llamamos autocracias, unas dictaduras de nuevo cuño. Spin dictatorship have been recently described. Y ellos están trabajando muy específicamente en el ámbito de la desinformación y el efecto de la desinformación en la democracia, y en particular en el ascenso de estas nuevas autocracias que se disfrazan de algún modo democráticas cuando en realidad son pura y sencillamente dictaduras. Estos dos nuevos amigos son Chris Simon. Él es un especialista específicamente en desinformación. Él ha estudiado y ha trabajado intensamente en Chicago. Tenéis su biografía, no quiero entreteneros mucho porque su biografía está en internet, está accesible a cualquiera, pero es un joven pero ya muy consolidado estudioso de lo que tiene que ver con la desinformación y las amenazas de la desinformación sobre la democracia. Y Sahra-Josephine Hjorth, sorry if I don't pronounce it.
No, it was quite good.
Sara es de origen, una mezcla de orígenes europeos, pero también ha trabajado intensamente en Estados Unidos y también en el ámbito específico de la desinformación, de las ciencias de la información y de su efecto en la democracia y en las dictaduras, ¿no? El Ateneo de Madrid quisiera, we would like to start this relationship, this little event that we are having, as the beginning of something else, something that we have still to define. But it could be a cátedra, it could be a course, it could be the Ateneo is it's of course a great place to meet and to discuss. The Ateneo has always been a motor, so to speak, in the process of democratization in Spain. This is a very open house. Always with the democracy, always the liberty, always with freedom, and those are issues, and those are things that we are very glad to celebrate here in Madrid and to expand it to other places in the world. So very happy to have you guys in the name of the members of the Ateneo de Madrid, and we are also streaming the event, so we will have probably some other friends looking at us from outside. And I would like to start the conversation with a big applause to our new friends. Thank you. I'm going to start the conversation, and I hope that you please take the floor whenever you want. I will start with a broad question, which is probably so complicated to answer in just 30 seconds, but if we can start by answering why is fake news and misinformation a threat to democracy. ¿Por qué la desinformación, las fake news, son una amenaza para la democracia? ¿Cuáles son vuestras experiencias? Si os parece bien, empezamos contigo, Sara.
So to say a little bit about what I do, and that's my frame of reference, as I work with over 800,000 young people and over 130 NGOs, and we've created a learning space for them that we call a support system in your pocket, where they can access information about the most critical issues in the world directly from an NGO that somehow deals with that. An example of that is we work with CARE in Peru for the women to learn about their menstruation and their general sexual and reproductive health. And the reason why it's incredibly important to our users is that I represent a technology company. And when we first founded technology companies, those of us who did that kind of thought that we didn't have to take the consequences of the products that we built. We thought they were almost neutral in their creation. So as long as we facilitate something, what happens in that space, we claimed was not our responsibility. But now we've seen 10 or 15 years of technology companies not taking responsibility for the conversations and the wrong things and the wrong messages that are being spread in those networks. So it's tremendously important to me and a lot of the people that I work with to create safe spaces for young people and to figure out how we leverage technology to also provide a guide for whether something is actually correct or not correct, and how do we even assess that. It's a very difficult thing, and it's a complete nightmare to figure out, but someone has to begin trying to figure that out.
And for me, at the Obama Foundation, what I do, I help run the Leaders Europe program. And what we are doing is creating a cohort of young leaders from Europe who are committed to ethical leadership in the vision of President and Mrs. Obama. And when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, the reason it's so important for democracy is because we need to set a standard, right? We need to all work around the same level of facts, of truth. And when we don't have that, our societies cannot move forward. So what we're looking to do is to create a network here in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, across the world, of young people who can bring that message forward into their various sectors, whether it be tech, whether it be education, climate change, so on and so forth, to really create this next generation of leaders who can lead us as a globe forward.
No, just very, very briefly. Again, thank you, Luis, for having us here. Thanks to Chris and to Sahra. I want to bring in the perspective from autocratic regimes, because fake news is a problem for functioning democracies, as we've seen very clearly in 2016, 2020, Brexit, Catalonia. I mean, it's been clearly in different spaces that we have seen the way in which fake news have been directed to undermine democracy. But in places where we are living under autocracy, this problem is on steroids. So it's exponential, because it's all fake news. There is no real news. At least in the US, in Europe, there is the alternative. There is the choice. So you have to educate the public opinion, or at least make them aware of how to choose, how to filter. In places where we are under autocracies, it's all fake news. It's all disinformation. It's all manipulation. So this is one of the big challenges that we have in order to confront autocracies, because people confront autocracies if they know the reasons why. Beyond just the material reasons, if they have the information about the wrongdoing of the regimes, about the corruption, about the manipulation, about their alliances, but none of that becomes available to people under autocratic regimes. So what I believe it's important is when we talk about disinformation and fake news, that we differentiate where are we talking about that problem, because that problem requires a different understanding if you are talking about disinformation and fake news in established democracy than if you are talking about that problem under an autocracy. But it's the same problem, and I want to end this by saying the same problem and the same origin. And the origin are the autocrats. So it's been very clear to us in the case of Venezuela, but this is true for other countries, that there is a direct collaboration of Russia and China. Russia providing the content, providing the ways in which to manipulate, in which to create confusion, and China providing a lot of the technology. So there is a clear attack of mighty powers, Russia, China, Iran, and others, against democracies. And this becomes very clear in countries like ours, like Venezuela and other places, where these big countries, these mighty powers, are providing a lifeline of support. And part of that lifeline is the way in which to manipulate the news, the reality.
Sahra, Sahra trabaja en una parte de su trabajo altruista con la Fundación información, pero trabaja en una empresa que se llama Canopy, entiendo, Canopy, que ofrece soluciones tecnológicas para la difusión de información en colectivos, en NGOs, jóvenes, etc. You mentioned that these companies that are 15 years old, we know all of them. Of course, I understand that you mean Twitter, that you mean Instagram,
Yeah.
you mean WhatsApp, etc. You said that they are not responsible on the contents, and that's probably a problem. What's that? I mean, that means that one solution would be censorship or self-censorship in these companies, or a legislation that establishes that you cannot publish certain things. I mean, we have seen, hemos visto cómo Twitter cancelaba la cuenta de Donald Trump, por ejemplo. Y uno se pregunta, ¿es esa la forma? Es decir, hay que dejar a las compañías, should we allow the companies to censor the information or to decide, or should be the state, the legislation? How can we deal with that? First in democracies, we'll talk to autocracies afterwards.
Well, I think one of the fundamental problems we're still trying to solve is that we have companies acting as if they were states. We have companies whose economies have become so big, their reach and their finances, can actively influence the global order more than many of the countries in the world. So I don't think any of us thought, I joined Facebook the first year it came out, I think it was in 2004. I don't think any of us really understood the effect that it would have beyond connecting you with a person that you already knew. It would change how we shop, how we date, how we travel. I mean, basically everything. And when you have an institution like that lacks governance, it took us quite a bit of time to build governance for a world that still isn't really working. And then all of a sudden you have this organization that comes in and has a complete lack of governance, and it's fueled by usually venture capital with this, at least the primary purpose of generating a profit. And that is a problem. There hasn't been any easy solutions yet, so I don't think banning a certain person. I think actually some of the problems, I come from a Scandinavian context. There was a very surprising election outcome in Sweden that was determined this morning, where Moderator got a way bigger following. I mean, some of us had predicted it. And there, for many years in Sweden, if something was unpopular or if it was considered semi-racist or controversial, they kind of they hid it away and they didn't want to talk about it. They threw them out of the conversation. And by not including them in the conversation, I think they fueled that they had a much bigger growth. So I never think excluding people from the conversation is the answer. I know Facebook has been experimenting with an international advisory board where the former Prime Minister of Denmark is also one of the people trying to set ethical guidelines for how do we facilitate this community. So those are ideas I find interesting. I know when we were with President Obama in Copenhagen, we also had a workshop where some of our fellows tackled this issue, and we talked more actively about, for example, there are certain newspapers that are known to not publish things that are facts. And then, of course, there are some that are more in the gray and some that are better than that. So should we be experimenting with different kinds of scores? Can we use artificial intelligence over time to say what's the general validity of this particular news source? These are controversial things, but there are things that people are beginning to look into. And they're difficult and can also, just like Facebook and Reddit, can be misused, but we have to try to find ways of creating a transparency because we think technology is neutral and it isn't.
It isn't?
No.
Now, Leopoldo, you've been working already and you have suffered, of course, you are suffering every single day the consequences of disinformation. How does Maduro do it, for example? I mean, tell us about your own experience and how do you feel that the system is pressing and insulting, etc.? And I'm sure that you have other examples of these autocracies like yours.
Well, there are many examples. A couple of thoughts on that. In 2014, when we called for protests against Maduro, calling Maduro clearly a dictator and calling people out to the streets, at that moment, 2014, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, it was very open. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, social media was very democratic. And we had the advantage because the people were, in a way, expressing what was being said in social media. Years after that, I can tell you that that conversation now in Venezuela, and it's the same in every autocratic regime that I've been in contact with leaders from, it's completely contaminated and it's completely manipulated. So these autocratic regimes knew that this was the new game. So they engaged this new game, taking advantage of the technology, creating trolls, creating bots, creating content, understanding how to manipulate. That's why I mentioned that the Russian influence is not just a technological influence, but it's a way of how to manipulate the social consciousness of a people, the public opinion. So they smear people, they attack people, they create partly true accusations that then evolve into a moral assassination of anybody who is confronting the regime. To give you some figures, there are different NGOs that try to analyze what is happening. So in any given month, the dictatorship in Venezuela promotes something like 20 million hashtags. And the democratic sectors can reach to 20,000, 30,000. So that's a spread of that battle in the social media. They have armies of people that are in buildings, entire buildings with thousands of people who are part of this disinformation campaign. But it's not just Maduro. Then comes the Russians, and then it comes the Cubans, and then it becomes a way in which they use this army to manipulate public opinion in different countries. So in Venezuela, any given year, in the trending topics of Twitter, you find a news about Ecuador, or a news about an attack or an issue on Colombia, or maybe from an Asian country or an African country, and you ask why. What does this have to do? I mean, you can even see some Twitter trendings that are in Arabic, so it's not even the same alphabet. And the answer to that is that these trolls, these armies, are being used for a global campaign as well. So when there is a global issue, they all fly and they all attack and they all create critical mass in that place. That's what happened. That's what happened in Catalonia here in Spain, and it's all very well recorded. That's what happened in Brexit as well. But it happens every day under autocratic regimes. So we need to figure out a way in which to confront this. I don't have all the answers. People like Sahra work on the technological area. But what I do know, and that's why I think this conversation is very important, is that we need to present the problem. I mean, this is what's happening. The conversation under autocratic regimes is completely manipulated, it's completely contaminated, and there needs to be awareness of that, and there needs to be support to making a change in that reality.
Entiendo entonces que todas esas plataformas, todos esos que acabas de describir, edificios de jovencitos entrando en las redes, propagando nunca mejor dicho, la propaganda, valga la redundancia, del sistema, etcétera. Entiendo que no es un fenómeno ni de derechas ni de izquierdas. It's not an issue of left or right. I mean, it's all over. Y entiendo que también es un problema de los sistemas democráticos, es decir, que también se difunden las fake news en sistemas democráticos para favorecer opciones populistas, tanto de derechas como de izquierdas. Entonces, Chris, what can we do with that? I mean, what are the solutions that people like you are finding on what is the solution, I mean, against a superpower like this?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is the question, right? I think one important thing is, like I was saying earlier, to establish a base level that we all can work with, that left and right can come together and establish as truth, as fact, and move from that point forward. That being said, I think what Sahra-Josephine was touching on earlier, regulation in some sort, in my opinion, is part of the solution. I don't know if that's self-regulation, if that's government regulation, but I think one thing that I look at here in Europe that's very interesting is how the European Union is leading on these tech regulations. I think that's something that is good, that you all are working towards a more secure digital future, whatever that may look like. But I think one of the most important pieces to this puzzle is how we ourselves as individuals engage with this issue. with fake news, with misinformation, with protecting democracy. That comes on one level as a screen of the news that we intake, that we look at on our phones, on our computers, that get sent to us on our emails. Another layer to that is making sure that we educate those, whether young, whether old, to know what they're looking at, to be able to establish fact versus opinion, and really creating a system where that is ingrained and we can, again, like I said, move forward as a group and not exist in two information spheres, or multiple information spheres for that matter.
¿Es realmente muy distinta la legislación de la Unión Europea de la legislación en Estados Unidos? So it's very different, the legislation, how it works in the US. I remember probably a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, sorry about the, with my memory, but I remember the Facebook president coming to the European Parliament 2 years ago, probably. You guys remember for sure. Zuckerberg came to the European Parliament, and of course tuvimos a todos los grupos del arco europeo, todos los grupos eligiendo quién iba a ser su portavoz para afrontar la comparecencia de Zuckerberg, el presidente de Facebook, ¿no? Y recuerdo, yo en aquel momento estaba haciendo un trabajo con el Parlamento Europeo, con el Grupo Socialista del Parlamento Europeo, y recuerdo muy bien el momento en el que todos los grupos europeos estaban eligiendo quién sería el portavoz, who would be the speaker to talk with Zuckerberg. That meant that no one really had a clear message on what to ask Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg came to the European Parliament and basically said whatever he wanted. It was a symbol of how far we are in understanding the meaning of politics in this. Aquellos europarlamentarios no sabían ni qué decir, tenían cada uno su minuto de gloria para decirle 4 cosas a Zuckerberg, pero Zuckerberg era... Y entonces alguien dijo, es como cuando llamas, cuando una abuelita o un abuelito llama al señor que te pone la wifi, ¿no?, en casa. Y, oiga, póngame usted la wifi. Claro, nadie le discute al que pone la wifi, que eso, dónde se pone, dónde se deja de poner, ¿no? Era como una... It was a very long distance between these members of the European Parliament and Zuckerberg that knew everything. And I understand that that's the big difference between the power, big power of the technology companies and the politicians that are basically starting to understand what this means. So is that different, the US and Europe with regard to this?
I think the level of understanding probably isn't as different, but the level of legislation is different. So I think that we've made some great advances in the EU, first with GDPR, then we have had Schrems-2 come after that. There's an increasing awareness of cybersecurity.
Álvaro, ahora de pronto habéis subido. Okay.
In Denmark, there was recently, as much as last month, old Google products and Chromebooks were taken out of schools because they didn't have the proper data agreements in place. So you're actually the students are opting into way more than they're aware of, and that data is being migrated across YouTube and other products that they own. So I think that there is a sort of technological awakening in trying to understand the impact of the products. But I think, unfortunately, it's happening so late that these products are integrated in such a great way that we can never really pull them out. So there's going to be this great battle in what's going to happen and how the technologies are going to adapt. But I do think we see some of the big giants are willing, the moment you threaten them on their pocket, they do have to make some changes. So I think from a legal perspective, we are making advances, but I think what worries me is a couple of things. Again, if we don't understand technology and how technology is built, it's very difficult to ask the right questions. So for example, when I sell educational products, people very rarely ask me about how will this product impact a student's way of learning? Are we conditioning them to learn in a certain way? So I was brought up in the Nordics, and I'm socialized to very much believe in a way of learning with students. It's problem-based, it's social, it's very Nordic. And those values are ingrained in a lot of the services that I create because they come from my mind, and then I tell my designers what to do. So if I buy a learning platform from China, that is going to be conditioned by what they believe about learning. And this is just a concrete example from my world, but every piece of technology is to some extent like that, and we call it, different kinds of bias in software. And we have to educate a lot more people about that topic specifically. And then I think when you talk about education, that we're facing such ever-changing global landscape that we have to get back to teaching ourselves and our students some of these very critical skills: technological understanding, ethics, critical thinking. What am I seeing? How am I decoding the world? I was recently, for the first time, a victim of a large and somewhat still ongoing disinformation campaign after joining the Obama's program. And it was shocking to me to see how organized it was and how it follows a very predictable pattern. And the moment we begin to understand those patterns and the people around us understand that pattern, we can also do something about it earlier on. So something has to be done, because I believe, and I can't talk for, on behalf of all the European leaders, but some of the women that are closest to me in the European Leaders Program, we have experienced a lot of very devastating things online, both from, of course, as some of you know, as your social presence grows, individuals might, contact you in various ways, but also from institutions, from tabloid press, from, either left or right-hand press, depending on what side of the aisle you're on. And I'm worried that it's going to discourage the next generation of leaders. And I'm seeing certain patterns with women that are very pronounced here in Europe, especially women of ethnic background. But if we don't understand this, and if we don't do something about it, and if we don't equip the leader as well as the public to understand the patterns that happen when you try to miscredit a person that's promoting social change, it's going to result in people, rethinking what they're doing. So I work for a private company, and that private company, I can't just one day say I don't want to be in the public eye anymore, because I have shareholders, and I built this company. It's my company, and it's just as much as my other two children. It's my child, and it came out of me. But I will say that I've been tremendously discouraged to ever run for public office. And not because I don't think I have ideas, but I just couldn't imagine having to live a life like this all the time.
What was the origin of that? Who was that? Who was attacking?
So for me, it started when I joined the Obama program. And unfortunately, sometimes if something big happens in your life and you become a public person, there might be people who view you as a threat. Yeah. Is she going to run for office? What is her political agenda? Whom nominated her? I was nominated by the former prime minister in Denmark. He obviously also has people who are not very fond of him. So I think that there are sometimes mechanisms at play where individuals who are trying to promote social change at a grassroots level or political change are all of a sudden put into a much bigger ecosystem of behaviors that we're not properly trained to be prepared for. And I know that's something you guys are also thinking very actively about.
Absolutely, yeah. It's an ongoing issue for us and for many other organizations like ours. And I think, to your point, we've seen that individuals are being attacked, but also corporations, even full industries, full sectors are being attacked with fake news and misinformation just to change narratives and steer certain types of thinking. And it is something that we're obviously trying to address, right? How we go about that? That's why we're here.
Yeah. Leopoldo, en América Latina hay grandísima distancia, supongo, con respecto a la legislación, con respecto de... O sea, hay un campo mucho más amplio que en Europa, entiendo, para las autocracias, para manipular y para dominar el espacio público, sospecho, ¿no?
No, sin duda, y sobre todo en los países en donde hay ya una autocracia, no hay espacio para la alternativa. No hay prensa libre, no hay posibilidad de competir en la misma escala. But I want to make a reference to part of kind of the human aspect of this, because what Sahra was saying I think is very important when she said that she's been discouraged to run for public office, and that I think that's something that can be widespread now, and it's understandable because throwing yourself to that, I don't know how you say, paredón de fusilamiento.
Sí, se entiende.
Yes, throw yourself into that swamp of fake news and disinformation. It's something that takes people away from it. So I've been talking to people from many places that are under autocracies, Hong Kong, Zimbabwe, Iran, Turkey, Belarus, Russia, Nicaragua, Cuba, and it's very interesting to see how this is something that affects personally. And I have seen how many great leaders become crumbled and become disengaged and even take distance from their own fight for freedom in their own countries because of the fear of being attacked in social media by this disinformation machinery. So this is something that needs to be addressed. And I think the first step is what we're doing today, is to talk about this. And I believe that talking about this in places like Spain or any other European country or any other established democracy needs to be a place of trying to diminish the polarization that happens in these countries, because this is an issue that is as important for those in the right or those on the left, for those conservatives or liberals. This is something that is essential, that needs to be addressed. And as Sahra said, and I believe that is true, we are late, but we need to engage in this at all levels. And in the fight for freedom, it's fundamental that we encourage people to continue to fight. So when Sahra was attacked some weeks ago, we had a conversation, and I just shared with her my personal experience. I said, Sahra, you need to deal with it. I mean, take your head up. I mean, you are going to be attacked. As the Quijote said, the dogs are barking because you're passing through. Los perros ladran porque estás pasando. So, just feel that you're doing the right thing. And don't be affected by it. So you need to have, as the people who are the victims of this, you need to have a lot of self-control and a lot of just commitment to the cause and to continue to go forward regardless. But the issue needs to be addressed.
But I also, if I can just interject a thing, I also think that we actually, so we train, for example, when we train activists, we train them to understand what will happen next. That's a lot of the conversations we also have. The more you understand about what is happening around the corner, the more you see a pattern, you know how to act, because you know what to expect, and you become less afraid. And I think that in this whole digital space, we need to begin massively training people for some of the same things. Most people still don't understand the difference between misinformation, disinformation, and fake news, right? So for example, again, I felt I was more in personal danger when I used to live in Russia, and I was a part of some of the protests in 2011. I was more in physical danger because it was pretty dangerous to be there, but I felt I knew what was happening. I'd read so many books, I'd talked to so many people, I'd been there so many times that there was a predictable pattern. And I never really felt afraid, even some days I probably should have. But I don't feel like I understood the same things with online. Even me who works in security realized I didn't have my own private cybersecurity in order. I had my Facebook hacked. I lost, my Facebook. I'm never going to get it back. Now I know what an algorithm with what it looks like with a new Facebook with no algorithm, because I really get very weird content promoted to me. So they must have done really great profiling over the last many years. But even me, who's supposed to be an expert on technology and really understand how these things work, I was hacked. We were attempted hacked several times. So I don't fully understand the patterns. I don't know who to look to. I don't know where to get that training. I don't know when my fellow friends and leaders call and say, now this is happening to me. I don't have that place to say, you should start here. So that place, I feel like with the physical infrastructure of changing the world, of being an activist, of mobilizing, we do have years of body of literature and rich experience from people like you, from people like Sergio Popovic, who has inspired me a lot. But in the digital space, we're lacking the leaders and the literature and the next wave of training, in my opinion.
Krista, I'm going to make a question for you, pero solo por explicar un poco, la Fundación Obama tiene un programa que yo he conocido recientemente por Leopoldo, un programa de líderes mundiales, de jóvenes líderes mundiales, maravilloso, por cierto. Cuando uno explora un poco es una belleza de programa. Why, Chris, is the Obama Foundation worried with this, with the lot of issues that are around with regard to this global leaders project that President Obama is leading? Why fake news, why misinformation, why disinformation is an issue for the foundation?
Absolutely. Well, I think the main reason is that fake news is an issue that touches every other issue out there. Climate change, business, gender equality, homophobia, all these issues have some root in fake news and misinformation. So it's really attacking that root, figuring out a solution that can be spread across different sectors, across different industries, through our leaders like Sahra-Josephine and many others, to find solutions that suit their industries, their sectors, and then just expand from there. And coming back to this question about education, empowering our leaders to then bring the message forward to their leaders, and then it'll have this expanding effect across the whole world. That's what we're hoping for. And I think youth is a key aspect of that. We're on the precipice of a lot of change, at least as a young person, that's what I feel. And I think empowering people around my age, in their early 30s, early 40s, late 20s, is the key to unlocking a lot of solutions that are locked in the minds of people who are afraid, like Sahra-Josephine was saying, to step up and step forward because of these issues around misinformation that are very intimidating.
Uh-huh. Estamos hablando mucho de las dificultades y Sara acaba de explicar el pesar de sufrir de pronto ataques personales en su vida laboral, en su vida personal. But tell us about successes that you have already achieved with regard to misinformation, or cases that at least give us some hope on the possibility of doing things, not just the bad things, but also the good things. Some examples.
I think, like Leopoldo was touching on earlier, just opening the conversation is the first important step. Over the past few years, I'm sure we can all relate that there has been a huge increase in fake news, misinformation spreading around, or at least we have become more aware of it. And the first step to addressing the issue is naming the issue and having conversations like this, just sharing personal experiences, sharing knowledge, and just elevating the discussion up and up and up until we can kind of break into that level of actionable items that we can implement into our programs, into our companies, into our movements.
Now, guys, sorry to interrupt. Isn't it curious that the only person, or the person that has been used the term fake news more often and more successfully is President Donald Trump? I mean, isn't it a curious metaphor of our times that la persona que más ha utilizado el término fake news y que lo maneja constantemente es precisamente el presidente Obama el presidente Trump, por supuesto. ¿Cómo puede ser? No es una metáfora de lo que nos sucede, ¿no? Once you get the frame, even if it's absolutely contrary to the reality, you get it, and it's I was always very surprised with that, and also I was very surprised that, for example, Hjorth Lakoff, which is so to speak also a friend of mine, was literally obsessed on do not answer every single thing that Trump says in Twitter, for example. Do not answer, because you know the metaphor of the elephant, etc. Don't think of an elephant, etc. So how can we fight that? Even the fake news issue has been already taken by its users.
So I can't speak exactly to that situation, but what I can speak to is that this issue around fake news, misinformation, is a term that is thrown around all the time, sometimes warranted, sometimes not. And it comes down to identifying truth. That simple. Not a simple issue, actually. But it is creating this network of individuals, whether they be leaders, whether they just be average citizens, who can make those distinctions between truth and opinion, which again comes back to the question of education and providing funds, providing opportunities, programs to people to learn how to make that distinction so that when the term fake news is thrown around incorrectly, people can recognize that and name that.
Okay.
So
More successes, yeah.
Well, I actually think that there are some lessons. I think that a lot of digital platforms have made some advances in beginning to curb abusive behavior. And I think that abusive behavior can be on the spectrum to misinformation and disinformation as well. So of course now when I go on Twitter or LinkedIn, I get a lot of messages where it says, this message has already been deleted, because that was probably someone who wanted to say something not very nice. So I think that's been one of the easier things to do that still has taken a very long time. So that's, that's a progression. We're already talking about the optimization of algorithms. Algorithms on social media are designed for conflict. The more conflict it creates, the more views it gets. So again, I'm talking about like the cohesion within a platform, like how we really built it, the fabric of what a platform is about. There, it's about promoting conflict to gain more exposure, to somehow sell something or promote something that has a bigger reach. We need to begin to rethink those structures. And then I agree that with education, there is a lot we can do. I agree very much with Chris about, of course, unfortunately, there is more disinformation and misinformation. But I also think that in a time where we've had a pandemic, US politics has gone nuts. I'm allowed to say that, you aren't. So we have gotten a vocabulary. So we now have words that describe behaviors that have been happening for a while, and they're becoming more mainstream. And we're seeing organizations come out and begin to do the education that is necessary. An example of that is the Copenhagen Democracy Summit and the organization behind the Alliance of Democracies. We made a course with them about deep fakes. That's for the general public. I mean, that's a very difficult, very new topic, and we're very happy with the educational content we made there. And as I think it was 2 weeks ago, they came back and they say they want to do something in this space as well. So I know that, those are small organizations, but they're putting content out there for different demographics, free of charge, and attempting to decode something as difficult, as deep fakes. And I think that's definitely something that we have to do. And then regulation, open conversation about, again, how things are built, the world becomes the way we want it to be by articulating it with words and having conversations and beginning to illustrate that, mirror that, paint it, write it. That we still have to have these big dreams and address what the problems are. And then if we don't address what is wrong right now, we will not build the path through it, I think.
Leopoldo, in the meantime, until legislation, regulation comes, how do you fight in your personal life and your people? How do you lead against misinformation? If you have examples that are successful. I remember, Leopoldo has, of course, millions of followers around the world, but how do you manage?
Well, I can tell you at the personal level, how do you manage? It's not managing. It's just knowing, being very, very true to what you are and to what you believe in, to what you're doing. Because I have seen, not just in Venezuela, but I have seen this as a pattern in many places where leaders are facing autocracies, that it really gets to them personally, that it really disengages people, that it starts a very destructive cycle of undermining your own self-esteem and your own awareness. And I believe that at a personal level, you just need to go forward. And you just need to, to take note of what's happening, but not to impact you.
Yeah.
So that's at a personal level. And then at a structural level, it's trying to fight back in some ways. But I mentioned before the scale. We're talking 30 million versus 30,000. That's a scale of what we're talking about. This is the case of Venezuela. In China, it's even wider. So there needs to be some technological development to get the message into these autocratic regimes. So winning the narrative battle requires different things. It requires to rethink the content of the message, because autocracies do have a very well thought out and a decades-long narrative that is very compelling. And especially it's very compelling to societies that are suffering, because it creates divisions and it gives easy answers to very complex questions. It says, you are suffering, you are poor, you don't have access to education, health, benefits, or savings because the corrupt elites or because of those that have. And it's just dividing society in such a way that it gives the benefit to the autocrats because they can get a hold on power, but they just divide and create a nihilist society. So that requires some alternatives in terms of the content of the message. But then there are some critical challenges around infrastructure. How do you get access to internet that doesn't go through the autocratic regimes? So this is something that is completely off the charts of somebody that lives in the US or in Europe. But in places like Venezuela and many, many other places, the regimes control the tube through which all internet goes through. So here, for example, we have Alberto Rabel. He has one of the most successful digital portals in Venezuela. It's off the grid for Venezuelans. It's off the grid. Venezuelans cannot access to it. So in order to access to it, they need to take a course, do a VPN, do it such and such. So you have infrastructure issues, access to internet, and then access to content, and then access for the individuals to have access to the communications, like having a smartphone. So winning the narrative battle, it requires to address different aspects: the content, the infrastructure, and then confronting the fake news and the misinformation and disinformation in itself. Mm-hmm. This requires commitment, this requires resources, and it requires cohesiveness as well. Because in order to confront this at a global level, there needs to be a collaboration between Europe and the United States to also be aware of these issues under autocratic regimes and to engage in the battle. Because this is a fight, in my view, that the free countries are losing because they are not even fighting the fight. And we have the autocrats fighting the fight. You have the Chinese, you have the Russians, you have the Iranians, you have the Cubans fighting this fight aggressively. Mm-hmm. So they go and they take opportunities in the Brexit or in Catalonia. I mentioned these examples because they're very widespread, but this happens every day. Mm-hmm. And on this side of the aisle, you don't have the free democracies engaging actively and proactively. Mm-hmm. And I think that's about to change. But there needs to be, as Chris said, there needs to be awareness and the will to fight the fight, because you're not going to win if you don't fight.
Mm-hmm. Bueno, vamos a terminar. 5-7 more minutes, but let's open the floor. Si hay preguntas, ¿alguien quiere participar en la conversación? Adelante.
Hola, Leopoldo. Siempre bien verte acá. Y ayer te estábamos esperando para cenar. Estábamos con la esposa del candidato presidente de Nicaragua, con Félix Maradiaga, y la situación, bueno, que te pasó a ti, y de hecho con la inspiración de Lilian, nos estuvo contando todo lo que hicieron en la oposición y cómo tú deberías, bueno, tenía el t-shirt, la camiseta, con la foto, igual que lo tenía Lilian contigo, etcétera, para inspirar a la oposición en Nicaragua, que está pasando una situación terrible, y como Nicaragua es tan pequeña, de hecho, sabes, tiene 6,5 millones de habitantes. Hay 7 millones de venezolanos exiliados, como tú y yo. O sea, somos más venezolanos que todos los nicaragüenses juntos. Entonces el mundo no presta atención a esos casos como Nicaragua o Cuba, que lleva toda la vida. ¿Cómo hacemos para que el mundo se dé cuenta? Porque a mí, como venezolano, me duele que estén dando 10 veces más dinero por cada ucraniano que por los venezolanos, cuando somos el doble de refugiados venezolanos con la mitad de la población y no nos ha invadido Rusia. Por lo menos Ucrania la ha invadido Rusia, pero a Venezuela y a Nicaragua y a Cuba no nos ha invadido nadie, excepto el virus del comunismo.
Sí. Well, José Luis' question is about how to create a global awareness of places that are remote to the public global conversation, like Nicaragua and many other places. I think there are different ways to address this, but the most important one is to create an alliance. So we are all committed to the fight for freedom everywhere. So this is why with Berta, we are creating with her and many other people an alliance to take the issue of political prisoners in her case and to make it global. Because these issues are very, very similar. So we've had conversations with Berta and with Vicky from Nicaragua and with Rwanda families of political prisoners or political prisoners from Saudi Arabia or from Cuba and Venezuela. And the reality is exactly the same, but they're completely atomized. So what we are trying to do is to create an alliance for simple things, and you mentioned one of them. So Lillian met with many of the families of political prisoners some months ago. And Lillian, my wife, who's here, she gave them very concrete advice. She said, on my experience, these are some of the things that you can do. For example, always have the face of your political prisoner in your chest. Something very similar. Always wear the same T-shirt with the same face, with the same message. Doesn't matter if you go to meet a senator or a congressman, or if you go to a TV program, or if you're walking in the street, always do that. And if you do that, not just the political prisoners of Venezuela, but you start seeing this pattern of, African families, Asian families, Hong Kongers, Iranians, Venezuelans, Cubans, all in the same way, addressing the issue in a similar way, you can create more consciousness, because this is another issue that requires another conversation, but political prisoners is the unknown pandemic of our days. It's increasing exponentially. Places like Iran, they have more than 7,000 political prisoners. In Hong Kong, more than 5,000 political prisoners. In Saudi Arabia, thousands of political prisoners. Not to talk about Africa. In Venezuela, more than 400 political prisoners, and on and on and on. But this conversation is completely under the radar, and it requires to be, again, to be part of the global conversation and to create collaboration among the different people. And I believe something very important is the attitude. We need to fight this fight for freedom at all levels with the right attitude. We cannot fight this fight with the attitude of those who are losing, or those who are with their forehead looking to the ground. We need to be encouraged by the fact that we are on the right side of history. As Chris said, we are promoting truth. We are promoting what we believe in. We strongly believe in democracy and what it means. We believe in freedom and what it means, and we're willing to fight for that. And I can tell you something. The word freedom can mean different things to different people. But for those who have been taking away their freedom from them, they have a very clear understanding of what it means to live a life without freedom. Mandela once said, in order to defend human rights, you need to be first a victim of human rights, in the sense that once you understand the lack of having your rights guaranteed or your freedom as part of your existence, you can defend it and promote it with more efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Questions? Points? No? Yep. Como quieras. Sí. Sí.
In regards to how does, how do you say it? You mentioned before the importance of critical thinking in assessing all these fake news. Is there maybe a failure of the education systems of democracies? I mean, the legacy education system in not raising citizens that have this kind of critical thinking to tell apart what's fake from what it isn't.
I think that's a great question. I personally think that we've had an overemphasis on STEM in the educational system for some time, and thereby not saying that that maths and technology and everything is not important, but it is. But we've thought of it as more isolated topics. And finally, something is happening. I mean, I can speak more for the educational system in the Nordics, but I also serve on something called the Confederation of Danish Industry on the board, the digital board. It's the biggest organization of basically like a union of companies in Denmark. And there, 5 years ago, they asked the CEO of Microsoft and Google and everybody, and then me, to say what is the #1 competence that we should be promoting in students. And then we each brought one, and I said digital ethics. And then the audience voted, and it was about 500 men aged, 50 above, and they all thought that digital ethics was very silly. I think I got 2% of the vote. And then sometimes I remind them of that now that I'm on the board, where digital ethics is certainly something that we talk about much more. I think that everything is so connected. And I think that the world's changed so fast that even our vocabulary sometimes cheats us a little bit. So we talk about the digital versus the physical. There's no such thing anymore. We are almost always also digital, always online at the same time as being in the physical world. And I think that when we work with students, if we don't update the educational system faster, we're doing them a disservice. So one of the things we've been doing during the pandemic is to train teachers. And first, we trained them in basic digital skills. Teachers, in my mind, are the most adaptable humans on earth. I mean, they had to completely reinvent how they work overnight and, provide all the students, adults and kids all over the world with like a new way of learning overnight. And that's incredible. And, supporting them to do that was the first step. But the second step we entered was to begin to talk about the things in digital and physical that are really influencing students that we don't see in the system. Here I'm talking about like cyberbullying or revenge porn. Those are things that teachers are confronted with all the time if they have students who actually trust them enough to tell them something's happening to them. But we don't equip them with the skills to be able to handle that interplay between digital and physical. So we have to start rethinking how we equip teachers and students with a different kind of skill set that will merge what we before saw as more creative and the arts with the digital, because all of it's coming together. And to be able to become, the new trainers of ethical AI or whatever jobs the young people will have in the future, they have to have the strong foothold in both camps in order to create the future that we want.
And I think to answer your question, this issue is relatively new, right? So educational institutions have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, but this issue of fake news and misinformation, disinformation is relatively new. So I think it will take time to adjust these longstanding institutions to meet these new needs. That being said, I think it also comes down, like I was saying earlier, to each and every one of us to be stewards of democracy, to implement our version of democracy into our children, into our families at different stages of life so that they can grow into that pattern of updating these longstanding institutions as the situation changes, and so they fit the times that we're living in.
All right. If there's no more questions, Chris, thank you very much. Sarah, thank you very much. And of course, Leopoldo, thank you. As we said, this is not supposed to be just a conversation. It's supposed to be the beginning of a longer conversation. Hopefully with you guys. Welcome anytime at the Ateneo de Madrid from now on. And let's do that. Let's start working on that. I promise that I will follow Leopoldo and you guys and try to find a way to set the issue, probably in the form of a white paper that we can work. We have just this wonderful place that can have you anytime that you want to keep working on this. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.